Hello, and welcome to On Geopolitics Explorations. I'm Bill Hurst, and in today's episode, part of our series exploring war, I'm joined by Doug Chalmers, who is now Master of Emmanuel College and also chair of the Management Committee of the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge, but prior to that served for 37 years in the British Army in very great variety of roles, all the way from private to general, and most recently as Deputy Chief of the Defense Staff. So welcome, Doug.
Bill, it is a joy to be with you today, and I've learned a lot from you over the last couple of years in my role as a chair of the management board of the Centre for Geopolitics. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation, actually, I think, which will help us put some of the things that are going on in today's broader world, I think, into a deeper historical and principle-based perspective.
Wonderful. So starting off, what do you think is sort of the simplest or most basic or most traditional way to think of war? I mean, what are some sort of general ideas that one might have of war, just starting from a sort of baseline?
I think I might take a step back, and I didn't really sort of explore my own service career. So I should say
Sure.
I joined back in 1984. So the Cold War was still very firmly on, as was sort of Northern Ireland for us. And I was in the infantry and obviously went through those sort of days, both in Germany and in Northern Ireland, and then served in a variety of the things that occurred in the Balkans. Also served with the United Nations over in Cambodia during that period of time. And it was those experiences, both in the Balkans and in Cambodia, that really made me curious and start to read deeper into this very, very topic. And then experience after that through the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. And dare I say it, the Russia-Ukraine factors that we're seeing now, and that be but one war that we're seeing in today's world, I think has sort of sharpened my focus on this. And I was very lucky as a young major to be seconded to America for a period of time, where I was able to go through a thing they call the School of Advanced Military Studies in Kansas, which is where I really had the time and the space and indeed the academic support to look at some of this, I think, in greater detail. And then later in my career, I had the good fortune to come here to Cambridge to do the MPhil in International Relations, which is where my understanding of what the centre stands for and its purpose, I strongly believe in, and hence I'm keen to it. But going back to your question, one of the things we had to do at the School of Advanced Military Studies is go back and read many of what I would term as the greats. And to answer the question, I think for me anyway, my personal view is you have to really start with Thucydides and his history over the Peloponnesian Wars, which for those listeners who may or may not be aware of it, took place sort of 431 to 404 BC, give or take, and really saw the rise of Athens, which was part of the Delian League. And that rise installed fear in Sparta, which was the leader of the Peloponnesian League at the time, and this sort of tension that went backwards and forwards. Now, there's much to be gained out of Thucydides, not just his sort of analysis of some of the reasons why this war came out from that structural transfer of power between Athens and Sparta, but it's quite nuanced. But if I was to answer your question directly, he, for me, distilled some of the drivers for this down to fear, honor, and interest. And I've not yet found a better explanation than that. And what that means, I think, in terms of fear, is states can act preemptively against perceived threats and are often sort of stirred up to that. And that fear that was in Sparta against the perceived threat is a sort of the example he's talking to, but he looks broader than that. And then on the honor side of it, there is a desire to preserve the prestige of the state, of the alliance, and also the individuals in their time on watch when these sort of shifts take place. But then also, which is the interest word, is pursue their own advantage. And that pursuit of advantage can often be at the expense of peace. So long-winded answer, but for me to answer the first bit there, I think Thucydides captured it: fear, honor, and interest. And before I hand over, I would say that those three that I've just described, and I've given you quick sound bites of what I believe Thucydides meant by fear, honor, and interest, are not static. So what might cause a state to move into arming, deterrence, alliance management, and we see this in today's world, is one thing. Then if conflict was to begin, the weight between fear, honor, and interest changes. And my reading of war as it goes through, I think, is that that weight consistently changes, which I think Thucydides does touch on. He highlights that, alliance motivations, individual human motivations, and the basic human variables that sit within all those things play almost as much of a part as to the structural shift of power that can be at play.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And if we think about that, then in terms of some specific examples, just to make it maybe a bit more relatable, in that you were mentioning at the beginning the Cold War and the Troubles in Northern Ireland. If we think about the Cold War, fear seems to have been the dominant one of those three, certainly in Europe, right? Everyone was so afraid, both on the NATO side and on the Warsaw Pact side, that they didn't actually end up going into combat with each other, as much as they might feel dishonored or wanting to pursue their interests. Whereas perhaps at some point in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the balance shifted such that various parties came to see the defense or advancement of honor as more expedient, and whatever had been there of fear diminished somewhat. Could we think of it that way in explaining those two conflicts and why they started?
I think you can, and actually, but with massive caveats, if I may describe, because there is a difference on state war, which is more what Thucydides was talking about, which is mobilizing, populations into war against other populations, and therefore it's that sort of the state element. And bear in mind, Thucydides wrote this long before we understood states as we do now, which is why those words of leagues and others, I think, are relevant. But we today call it state-on-state war. I think is slightly different than what you are describing of what was a tension between a state and then a subgroup within a state onto it. What we would call, well, depending on how you view it, but an insurgency or a rising, etc., within, of which there are many variations, but it's slightly different between the two. But I do think there is a bit here which Thucydides does touch on, which is one of his enduring lessons, or ones that I read from his enduring lessons, is that there needs to be some self-restraint. Civil strife and how it's managed within the state has a potentially fuel broader wars. Now, in the Northern Ireland case, it didn't per se, but in others, and I'll come back to that in a moment, I think it did. But also Thucydides highlights that unless there are genuine efforts to resolve underlying grievances, wars have a habit of persisting and can escalate. And we have seen that time and again. So I think you can do that. But I think the Northern Ireland analogy that you just screwed there also highlights that the weighting of fear, honor, and interest will be different compared to the two parties. And if I bring in another great, which we had to read several times before, and I'm really glad I did, because I don't think you understand it on first reading, is Clausewitz's work on war, which I think much of the enduring framework for the modern understanding of nature and character of war, I think, can be drawn on. And he talks in there about absolute and limited war. And inside of that, there is a sort of Northern Ireland fits into the limited war. For the UK, this was absolutely clearly a limited war. There was a real need for restraint, and there was sort of aspects of lessons learned from previous insurgencies or counterinsurgencies in the UK state about sort of hearts and minds and stuff. Stuff we might well come back to later. But that's Thucydides' need about getting after grievances, eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement and some pretty hard positions on both sides to reach consensus, actually, which at one point in terms of fear and honor in the beginning of Troubles would have been very hard to envisage, but that was able to be done. The other bit I would highlight, which I think comes back to Cold War, is you're right that there wasn't a war between the big states. But what we did see was a lot of what that Clausewitz bit of, I could describe as limited war or proxy wars, where we were definitely shuffling around the proverbial chessboard, chasing interest. And interest could be measured either in physical interest, and we talk often now about material interest, whether that be seaport access, rare earth materials, and so on and so forth. but there's also a broader sort of basing and overflight sort of interest as well, sort of a different version of empires, if I could say, in a different way, not looking for ownership, but looking for sort of element. That was quite hot. And for those that were involved in professional forces during the sort of post Second World War, those small wars were pretty active, actually. But there was a difference. Again, the states then viewed those as limited. And having sort of come in at the end of that, as I said, in the Cold War, there was a degree of code almost between the states in that soldiers did soldiers things, spies did spy things, diplomats did diplomatic type things. And generally speaking, those sort of boundaries kept those wars limited. And the risk of escalation and spiraling out of that was known by both states as something to be guarded against, because the awareness of what would happen if it had escalated into, Warsaw Pact and NATO, for example, going toe to toe, would naturally lead to some form of nuclear exchange, which could then cause a degree of damage to humanity beyond just the states involved.
Yeah, let's definitely come back around in a moment to some of these issues of non-state actors, insurgencies, and so on. But just sticking with the sort of state-to-state conflict for a moment, another aspect of this that I thought was rather interesting when we've talked about this before is this sense of sort of a division between war, peace, and crime.
Yeah.
And sort of how we can characterize violence inside and outside of states that way. Could you talk a bit about that?
No, I can. And good memory, Bill. I think when I was young, and I talked about my own personal journey coming through the Cold War, Cambodia and the Balkans, and those two were quite eye-opening for me, particularly what came out of the Balkans. And then as we headed into, post 9/11 activity, because in my earlier days, and I think it was true actually during the Cold War, and I linked into it back then, is that there was almost a degree of chivalry at that point, that peace was in a box, crime was sort of in a box, and war was in a box. And there were protocols and agreements that sort of kept fences around those boxes. I think in the West, we believed that. That's definitely how I was brought up as a sort of a young officer to begin with. On the state-on-state side, and I know we're going to come back to the non-state side, but on the state-on-state side, I think that was the case. In hindsight, I think the Soviet Union understood those rules and sort of abided by them, but I'm not sure if they believed in them, because they were structures that were put in place dominantly by the US influence, actually, in the post-Second World War elements that we went into it. But I think what we've seen since, with the end of the Cold War and the move to what we are seeing now, is I don't think that those fences between are as real as they were once upon a time. And I think that reflects the fact that I'm not sure that those in the East, if I could call that, and that's not a geographic East, that's a sort of the Russia, China, Far East, and even parts of the Middle East, never really believed in those constructs. And I think they saw more of a blurring of war, peace, and crime, if I could describe it as such, over that time, which I think is relevant today. And I think the internet has made some of those blurrings harder to keep apart. And therefore we are seeing, for example, organized crime sometimes has been a proxy on one state to operate in another state and to work some of that through. It's also a seams that non-state actors have also played into, of which I'd say the most dramatic case study for me, I think, has probably been ISIS recently, in terms of size and scale. But that's why I think we grew up with that bit. I think that is not as valid today as a construct. I think there are some in the West that still believe that construct exists, but I'm increasingly skeptical that that is how others view the world, where an anything goes approach more reflects, and they're more than happy to grey that boundary of peace and war. We call it threshold sometimes, that grey zone threshold, below the threshold conflict that goes on as well. And in that, I think crime is occasionally brought in.
Yeah. Before we begin to relax the boundaries, though, just so everybody listening understands what the boundaries are. I mean, war and peace, I assume, are basically, the presence or absence of violence or hostility between states. Is that a basic way to define that? I mean, when do you know you're at war or at peace in that classic construct?
Yeah, you kind of know it when you see it. In the good old days, of course, we would declare war, and therefore we'd all know we're in war. And I go back to that Clausewitz description between absolute war and limited war. And there is a hard line, and the perception, actually, Ukraine is a good example, probably right now. Russia, arguably is on a special operation. Ukraine is at war. They haven't declared war, but I think by any observation at the moment, it'd be hard not to describe that war. And for Ukraine, that's moving closer to absolute war. Russia, I think it's at the upper end of limited war, looking at the scale of resource that's been involved in it. So the clarity with which, the Westphalian state system formally moved into war, I think that boundary has gone. The shuffle of letters, for example, at the beginning of the Second World War, we just don't see that anymore. We drift into it. Why is that? I think there's a first mover advantage aspect in here. And the reality of first mover advantage is, you need to slow down your opponent's speed of recognition. To do that, in order that you slow down their speed of decision, in order that you slow down their speed of action, so that you can make the most of your first mover advantage. And therefore, formally declaring war, of course, goes against all of those things. So that's what I mean by that weakening of the boundary. I don't think we see the protocols and diplomatic sort of formal notes of war declaration that we used to. And I'm not sure we will in the same way going forward.
Right. So, I mean, that boundary, though, between peace and war, I guess, has always been somewhat amorphous, right? In the absence of, some act of a government that says in a very formal way, we now declare war on state X. We could say there's already a state of war between many of these combatants over history long before there was any formal declaration, or indeed that formal declarations of war of that sort are really an artifact of kind of the 18th, 19th, and first half of the 20th centuries.
Yeah, I concur. You've said it far more eloquently than I have. But there is this bit about limited war. This is where the absolute limited war bit that Clausewitz sort of talks about. Of course, both sides will see it slightly differently. And, the current case, like I say, Russia thinks it's in a limited war. For Ukraine, it's on the absolute side. And there are many limited wars which actually, and UK's been an example of it, is we don't like to call it a war, we call it a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Or we come up with a different description of an activity or an operation that does involve kinetic violence.
Right. Let's definitely come back to this issue of absolute and limited war, as well as non-state actors and the asymmetry of perception sometimes by different players in a war as to whether it's an absolute war or limited war. But before we do that, just to think about crime briefly. Crime, then, I guess, in this classic typology would be violence that is perpetrated inside of a single state by actors who are not affiliated with the state, at least as we'd classically conceive of crime, right? Most crime would be, sort of someone on the street attacks someone else to rob them, or breaks into a business or a house to steal things or to hurt someone. But that's not the government doing it, and it has nothing specifically to do with a particular state, although it happens within one state rather than between them. Is that a fair kind of characterization of how we think of crime classically, at least?
I think it is. And I think that is the way it has been for many a time. And countries, communities, then became countries, become states, set up systems, laws, etc., that their community do to police that. So it's managing that violence or damage. And I think theft, which may not involve violence, is very firmly in the same sort of box. And not only violence into that, I think is true. What we have seen, I say, is this is an expansion of the use of proxies over time. And I think the internet has had a part to play with this, where it has expanded the use of crime networks, sponsored, cultured, deniably, by other states to act as agents provocateurs, as it would have been called once upon a time, a long time ago, or sabotage, etc. within. Some of which could be violent. And, you could point to some of the assassination programs that you every now and again see described in the news. But I'd also put in there down to sort of financial crime. And of course, the input of cyber direct attacks on installations, which, that is a very live daily battle going on in between sort of offense and defense that's going on today. But also, I think the impact of cyber in the space of influence, whether that be bot factories spewing out multiple stories to confuse the population, mislead the population, convince of alternative narratives, etc. which then are deliberately done to sort of confuse the state's ability or delay the state's ability to pitch its own way. I think I would all put that in crime, because actually the laws of a state, and our country is a good example of that. Most of that internally in the UK will be called crime,
Yeah.
but it may well be originated or fueled from outside and by remote proxy sort of force.
Well, and maybe even some of the degree to which it's not clear whether or not it's coming from outside or is in fact a proxy action is part of what it's designed to be, or what makes it so difficult to sort of react against. If there's cyber attacks against large corporations or retail distributors or transport networks or things like this, indeed, that seem to have happened recently, it's difficult to know if that possibly could have been an action by some hostile state or non-state actor, or if it's just sort of generic crime, right?
I agree. And there's sort of a question that I remember some much more seasoned intelligence analysts than I, that I used to sort of work with, talk to, discuss issues with, is there's always a question of who benefits. And when you start to step back and look at some of the things that you would see and you work out who benefits, occasionally it is just genuine crime,
Mm-hmm.
but occasionally you can see a pattern where you think, hang on a minute, and this is starting to look like something a bit more, and the beneficiary of some of this collective may not be what we first might think.
Yeah, and I think some of where this is going is sort of complicating the picture a bit, right? So to think of what's crime, what's war, what's peace, what's a hostile action, what's an attack, what's a state,
Absolutely.
right? All of this we start to think about in more complicated ways. And so I guess where I'd like to sort of push you a bit next is to think about how to unpack different players in this, right? If we think about even just a war as Thucydides described it, right? You have the state mobilizing a population to support the fielding of an army to defend against or to go and attack another city's army.
Yeah.
Right. So we're dealing there with the military itself, the state itself, and then the population. Right. And I think if I remember correctly, you've also got this really nice formulation of the Clausewitzian Trinity, right?
It
Sort of the
does.
people, the armed forces, and the government, right?
It is. Well, I saw where you were going with that. And I know we'd had this chat before. I think the Clausewitzian Trinity, and it is a bit of a paradoxical Trinity, of which one reading of it, and if you read his words, there is the people, the commander and the army, actually, if I'd read it, because there's a generals and the army, the decision makers of elements in there, and then there is the government. That's one way of reading it. The other way of reading it, it comes out of his language, is on the government side, that is a subordination of some of the other things I'll talk to in a moment to reason and policy. So that's the government trying to be rational and creating policies over some of these choices. The commander in the army relates to chance and probability and the managing of chance and probability into that element. And the people comes down to primordial violence and hatred in that ways. And those three things interact with each other as things go through. And they are dynamic. And I've touched on this before. I think they are dynamic throughout a conflict. And that is what makes war, I think, a very complex and unpredictable phenomenon, which I go back to Thucydides. I think Thucydides tried hard to sort of talk to us. Some of the interpretations of Thucydides since, and Graham Allison's work on what he called the Thucydides trap, I think was a sensible thesis, but I think it missed some of these nuances that sort of come out. I think are very pertinent today for the reasons you've touched on. But that Trinity still fits and works, whichever interpretation you read, to the challenges you have just described.
Although I think if we go back to Thucydides, there are other examples in the story of the Peloponnesian War in which one leg of that trinity gets sort of hijacked by others, right? So if we think of sort of Alcibiades getting up in the assembly and making all of these great speeches as a kind of populist demagogue, as he's characterized, to channel that kind of hatred and passion of the populace into the totally misguided Sicilian expedition, right?
Yeah.
That the military, in fact, was not terribly enthused about undertaking.
Agree.
And so the military was acting more rationally than the government in that case.
Yeah. And sometimes, my own experience is probably linked to that, is the military do understand slightly better the chances and the probability and the fact that you don't have full control as you go into it. And I thought you were going to link on there, but I think this comes out to Thucydides as well, is this dynamic, that triangle or that trinity, the paradoxical trinity, as I sometimes think of it as, between people, commander, army, and the government. And you've given an example there. I think what's the government piece and the commander army piece and the people piece gets more complicated when you move into alliance territory and factionalism. And this, I think, Thucydides also highlighted, that you can get dragged into this, one, the way you've described it, but also by alliances, when one partner of alliance then gets pulled into something that then drags the others along, where their trinity and their home state may say one thing, but they get pulled into this and an escalation occurs because of it.
I mean, yes, absolutely. And that's something I think we will come back to in later discussions as well. But another way also to think about unpacking this is to think about what happens when one of the players in this interaction is a non-state violent actor, right? So if we do have a situation in which you've got the government, the armed forces, and the people, but then they're facing off against not necessarily another state that has the same trinity within it, but some kind of non-state violent actor, whether that's an insurgency, a terrorist group, a transnational criminal network, that would make the picture even more complicated, but also very different, no?
It would, but I think, and it links a bit into one of our earlier conversations, if it's a true non-state actor that has grown up, and I would use ISIS as an example of this, that I think, by my experience, was a genuine non-state actor that achieved a scale that literally came from nowhere and moved into that fielded conventional force, dominating huge sort of areas, and became a proto-state. I think I seem to remember it being described as at one time. Because it didn't have state sponsorships on the outside of it, actually getting consensus of states to help with the reduction of this non-state actor, although difficult, happened because there was risk to all the parties sort of around to it. And it was complicated, but I think that's where a genuine non-state actor, actually, there was an agreement. Where it gets more complicated is where these non-state actors are not actually 100% non-state actor, and they have some degree of sponsorship by a state, advocacy for by a state. And you've seen this, I think, whether it be in the Middle East or in other areas. If you go to the DRC and others where you've got these sort of groups as well that have state sponsorship, that's when it gets very, very mucky, where you've, on one piece of paper, you've got a non-state actor, but it's not really a completely non-state actor.
Right. Or you have a non-state actor that's trying very hard to take over the state, right? If we think about a revolutionary movement or certain kinds of insurgencies, or to separate and form their own state in a piece of what had been the larger state.
Sometimes sponsored by a neighboring state, which then adds to that complexity.
Absolutely. So, I mean, if we sort of abstract back a bit and think now about non-state actors and insurgencies and different kinds of conflict with non-state actors, I mean, the classic historical example of this that I can think of is colonial wars or anti-colonial wars in different periods. I mean, we could even go all the way back to the American Revolution as a classic case of this, right? Or the U.S. War of Independence as essentially an insurgency. And part of the difficulty then in facing off against the Continental Army for the British forces was they weren't really in the right frame of mind to fight an insurgency, perhaps.
Yeah, you and I have spoken about this before. I did a lot of service in America, as you know, and giving Independence Day speeches dressed in my red coat was obviously a moment of sort of amusement. I think it's a difficult one, that particular war, because I think the formed units, British redcoats and all the rest of it that was there, I think you're right. But when you move into the loyalists and what happened, which was, in many ways a civil war between the colonialists themselves, I think that's a pretty mucky story, actually, and a harder piece of history to look at. There was the French dimension that went in there. And if you go back a bit further, then I think the Canadian activities that were going on between Britain and France, often involving some of the indigenous groups in that sort of war, I think is worthy also of study, because I think it links back to some of the stuff we've been talking about earlier on. And then on the US, I lived in Texas for one of our establishments, and that was a much more easier Independence Day speech, because of course we had absolutely nothing to do that. But as the UK in my red coat. But that's actually the flip on the other side of it, where the land rights and the Texans that sort of came in there and the Mexican sort of wars that were going on at that time were a different dynamic completely, but linked into the same story.
Yes, I agree. Certainly, if we really want to understand the dynamic in the U.S. War of Independence, we've got to look at the 7 Years' War, so-called French and Indian War
Yeah,
in America, and the dynamic with France, as well as with different Native American groups, right? So from the 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 63, right, there's all kinds of complex politics between the French and different indigenous groups, as well
yeah,
as British and different indigenous groups. And in many ways, the loyalists fleeing to what became Canada is a big part of what established Canada as a viable
yeah,
entity in its own right. But if we look even more forward, I mean, there's lots of these kinds of anti-colonial rebellions that help structure kind of thinking about what an insurgency is or how to confront that, right? I mean, if we look in, I think it's 1854, 1856, the so-called Sepoy Rebellion in India,
yeah,
that then leads to the transfer from company to crown and a totally
yeah,
different way of policing and of defending the colony in India, right? Or the Boer War in South
yeah,
Africa, all of these things. But I think the one that really sticks in my mind, just from my limited knowledge of any of this, is the emergency in Malaya after the
yeah,
Second World War, in which basically internal conflict between different political groups inside what's now Malaysia, particularly peninsular part of Malaysia, led to the declaration of an emergency and rapid innovation of military strategy by the British colonial authorities in the mid to late 1950s, and particularly the work there of General Harold Briggs, right, who came
yeah.
up with a whole plan for how to address this that then became quite influential, I think, in a lot of people's thinking about insurgency and counterinsurgency. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, Bill. But before I do, I think you're quite
Mm,
right, and I think your quick sort of review we've had over what happened in North America, I think, you sort of plays back to our limited vice absolute discussion we
yeah.
had earlier on and the use of proxies. Highlighting that this is not new. And actually, if I go further back and even looking at how the Romans
Yeah.
worked there, you'll find a similar, in fact, littered with similar case studies from there, but how they sort of moved it through. I think sometimes the risk on some of these areas is you can think you understand a recipe and then you can take it from one area to another. And I have to, it's one of the reasons I think what the Centre of Geopolitics is trying to do, I think is really, really valid, is doing applied histories of the local and regional context to try and understand what would work and what would not work. Because in this particular type of war, absolute war being slightly different, ground plays more of a part. Because in absolute war, you're subordinate to the destruction, violence will dominate over it. In a limited war, how you work with proxies and sustain and deal with local grievances, I think matters a lot more. And the reason I say that is, I think the work that was done in what was called the Malayan emergency, as it was then, where it popped up, there are some elements to it that I think were unique to the Malayan Peninsula and the population within which this took place, and also the experience. So, General Sir Harold Briggs was actually brought back from retirement. He was a very experienced soldier, lot of experience of some of these areas we've talked about before over his time. He'd seen some of this in his service, both in the Second World War, before the Second World War, that had gone on to it before. And he understood, if my memory serves me right, in the Second World War, for example, he had served in what was then called Burma under sort of the slim sort of element for that. Therefore, he had that understanding of local and regional dynamics. And in the Malayan insurgency, there was an ethnicity factor between Malay and Chinese. And there was a geographic factor, which was it is a peninsula with sea on either side to do it. And he came up with a strategy, which really was to separate the communist guerrillas from their sources of support, particularly in the rural population. And that was especially with the ethnic Chinese squatters who were living on the fringe of the jungle. So there was an ethnicity and a geographic set of factors that were behind his plan. And his plan worked to a degree. In today's world, it would probably have a very different piece, but he established a population and spatial control, not just to control the people, but also to restrict movement of food supplies to help with that isolation of that group, which formed most of the insurgents. There was also resettlement, or what was described then as the new villages, which was an evolution of a policy concept that had been tried in the Boer War with not successful with some success in the Second Boer War, as you could write, but the long end stand speaks for itself. But the other bit which he also really pioneered, we would now call psychological warfare. They were quite focused on that, which was winning over hearts and minds. And that was sort of, making sure that these new villages had the amenities and they were a draw and attract, treating those populations with respect and accepting that they were creating grievance by moving people, but then trying to counter that grievance by providing those amenities, which is the hearts and minds sort of aspect to it. But also pushed really hard on civil military coordination. Actually, now I think about it, it sort of links back into that. And that's where, the civil governance structure linked then into the policing structures and the military structures is trying to unify the coordinations in there so that it was one sort of single approach. And, it had an effect. And as we know, that enabled the transition and the independence of Malaysia to Malaya to take place. And then the Malayan forces carried on the final yards of countering the insurgency on their watch in that sort of area. But the danger, and I know you'd ask me next, is so that worked there. But if you move it to somewhere else, and I would say time and space would say Vietnam in this place, I remember there was quite a lot of colours. You didn't have the ethnicity and you didn't have those geographic factors. And therefore, it was much harder to bring into being. And therefore, some of the lessons that the British had learnt in the Boer War became more pertinent than the success that had been achieved in Malaya.
Oh, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I hadn't actually considered the Boer War parallel in Vietnam. I mean, I think of Westmoreland and McNamara sitting around literally reading Briggs and reading about what he did and trying to interview people who had worked with him even and set up things that they thought of as being very much analogous to the new villages, these sort of model hamlets and so on that they were trying to build in South Vietnam. And they couldn't understand why it didn't work, right? They're frustrated throughout and they try to assess this, and they even try to undertake the same sort of food denial operations, as they're actually called in the new villages, somewhat ruthlessly. And that even fails. I mean, all it does is engender more sort of resentment from the population rather than any help. But the Boer War analogy is really interesting. And one way to think of it maybe is that for the United States, the war in Vietnam is a limited war.
Yeah.
But for the North Vietnamese, it's an absolute war.
I was just about to comment because the other big difference was there's North Vietnam with fielded armies of the army and an air force and parts of the Navy, which of course the Malayan insurgency did not have. So we had dominance of the sea and we had dominance of the air, and we didn't have fielded forces and that sort of chain before. And even the analogy of Boer I've drawn there, because I think there is some useful stuff in the Boer. We did try to literally quarter up the area, barbed wire boxes and all those sort of elements to it. But even there, it's different. Actually, that might be more applicable to Afghanistan necessarily than it would have been to sort of Vietnam. So that's why I think what I mentioned there was a real risk of you see something that works, you can think you can take that template and apply it, but you really have to understand, I think, the local culture, the local history in order to know what will work. And it goes back to the underlying grievance. And my personal experience is sometimes on Western interventions that I've been party to is there's often agreement on policy between Western capitals, but we miss sometimes understanding what will actually gain traction or address some of the grievances of the party in the country that we're trying to achieve and affect beneath. And, Iraq is different to Afghanistan, and you can keep going from there. And it's very difficult because if you're a diplomat or a soldier, you have a Syrian experience in one bit, you worked out what works, you move to a new theatre, and therefore you can't help but think, I have this experience, I'll apply that experience here before. Whereas I think the first step really is to almost take a step back, to go through a complete new listening exercise, understand the variables that are at play here, and then develop a strategy that fits that local and regional context.
So I think that's a really good segue then into actually a lot of the things that we will be discussing in the next episode. And we will have Doug back for a second episode to talk about some explorations of some more concrete themes. And on that note, thank you, Doug.
Thank you for having me on board.
Thanks very much for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye.